Meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee will come to order. Senator Graham is on his way and sent word that we should start before he arrives. Today, the Judiciary Committee will focus on two of our most critical responsibilities to the American people: protecting our national security and our Constitution. At the end of this year, an important and controversial surveillance authority known as Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, is set to expire. It is worth taking a moment to recall the history of this program. After 9/11/2001, the Bush administration launched a warrantless surveillance program without authorization from the courts or Congress. Years later, the committee heard dramatic testimony about White House officials pressuring Attorney General John Ashcroft from his hospital bed to reauthorize this surveillance program. He refused. After this surveillance program came to light, Congress retroactively authorized it in the FISA Amendments Act of 2008 as a temporary emergency tool to combat terrorism. That is what became Section 702. Today, nearly 2 decades later, Section 702 is touted as critical for a range of purposes, including countering China, tracking Russian atrocities in Ukraine, and even monitoring the distribution of fentanyl in the United States. There is no doubt that Section 702 is a valuable tool for collecting foreign intelligence, but as I have said for years, Section 702 also raises serious constitutional concerns. Only foreigners abroad may be targeted under Section 02. Let me repeat that. Only foreigners abroad may be targeted under Section 702. But in the course of gathering intelligence on foreigners, our government also collects the private communications of Americans who communicate with these individuals abroad. How many American communications are collected under Section 702? The government cannot and will not say. What we know is that hundreds of thousands of foreigners are targeted each year, and likely billions of communications are collected and stored on government databases. The government can then search these databases for Americans' email, phone calls, and text messages, all without a warrant. Just as a reminder, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution says, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supporting by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized." It was my view when this program was first authorized by Congress in 2008, and it's my view now that Section 702 does not sufficiently protect the privacy and civil liberties of Americans. That's why I joined with Senator Lee in a bipartisan 2012 effort to offer an amendment to require a warrant for any backdoor search of American communications. The government can then search these databases for emails, phone calls, as I mentioned earlier, and what is known as a backdoor search. The FBI alone conducted more than 200,000 warrantless searches of Americans in 2022. Since Senator Lee and I offered our amendment in 2012, the problems with Section 702 have continued. The court charged with overseeing this program has found, quote, persistent and widespread, close quote, violations of the rules governing Section 702. In just the latest example, it was recently revealed that the FBI has used Section 702 to conduct backdoor searches on the communications of Americans who were arrested in the racial justice protests following the murder of George Floyd, as well as individuals who participated in the January 6th insurrection. I understand that recently implemented remedial measures have already begun to reduce these egregious violations. I understand additional compliance measures are under consideration. These are good steps, but Congress also has a constitutional responsibility. So at the outset of today's hearing, let me say this. I will only support the reauthorization of Section 702 if there are significant significant reforms. And that means first and foremost addressing the warrantless surveillance of Americans in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Moreover, the reforms must also include safeguards to prevent future abuses and ensure effective oversight by Congress and the courts. Some of our colleagues believe it would be best to let this authority expire. Others argue that Congress should reauthorize Section 702 with minimal reform. As chair of this committee, I will work on a bipartisan basis to bridge this divide over the coming months. I understand the seriousness of this challenge. We can protect America's national security and the constitutional rights of the American people at the same time. Senator Graham has not arrived. I will start with the introduction of the witnesses. He may be coming in shortly. Today, we welcome 5 senior officials from the administration. Chris Fanzone, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, General Counsel of the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Next, we will hear from George Barnes, Deputy Director of the National Security Agency. We will then hear from the Deputy Director of the CIA, David Cohen. Following Mr. Cohen, we will hear from Paul Abate, the Deputy Director of the FBI. And lastly, we'll hear testimony from the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice, Matt Olson. After we swear in the witnesses, each witness will have 5 minutes to provide an opening statement. Then each senator 5 minutes to ask. I urge my colleagues to focus their question on today's hearing. In particular, I'd like to emphasize to everyone on both sides of the aisle that everyone on both sides of the aisle has a responsibility not to interfere in the special counsel's ongoing criminal investigation of the former president. Mr. Trump is entitled to the presumption of innocence. Attempting to litigate the indictment against him has no place in today's hearings. Now I'd ask the witnesses to stand and be sworn. Please raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth and the whole truth, so help you God? The record reflect that all of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. We'll begin with opening statements from OD&I General Counsel Chris Fanzone. Mr. Fanzone, you may proceed.